Welcome back. So as I mentioned last time, I got the tanks back from the welder and they made a couple of little mistakes, but managed to get them to sort those out before taking delivery of them. So my next job was to paint those because I wanted to paint them black so they can radiate heat even better than what they would do. So as you can see, just paint them with a sort of matte black all-in-one primer and paint. And then got the fittings put in there. So all those fittings are just going into a 1/2-inch NPT weld bung, which is what the welder put on there. And ultimately an inlet at the bottom and an outlet at the top, and then the other tank has an extra outlet for the coolant expansion tank. So because I've added 5 gallons of coolant, it has to go somewhere where it expands, so I'm installing this guy as well, and that's just going to take up the slack so that can handle a gallon of coolant when it gets hot. Alright, so this is what it looks like with everything installed. So this is the smaller tank in the front on the left hand side there, and has the outlet on the top there, inlet on the bottom, and then this is the larger tank there sort of after that. And so inlet on the bottom, outlet on the top. So they just basically one feeds to the other, and then they go through the heater loop. So the flow runs through the heater in the cabin and then back through the big tank and then through to the front tank and then back to the engine, and this is the expansion tank in there. So that's one of those ones you can set the pressure on it, and I've set it to 7 psi, so it'll allow the coolant to expand into it rather than pushing it back into the expansion tank back on the engine. And then ultimately if it fills up to 1 gallon, then the coolant will push back into the expansion tank back on the engine. So everything's installed there, and we've got the nice push-on fittings and stuff from the local hydraulic shop, so it was all nice and neat. Alright, so after I got all the tanks and stuff installed, I did a run. Started out with just warming everything up and making sure that there wasn't any air in the coolant system, because I had basically filled everything up as best as I could, priming those tanks and the lines, so I didn't have to try and do it via the engine. It actually worked really well. I clamped off the hoses running back to the engine prior to doing anything, and so I didn't introduce any air into the system. And when I basically broke the one connection and sort of tapped in the new tanks, I filled everything up as much as I could, and if there was any air in there, it didn't really show up. So looking here, this is over here on the left here is when I started the engine and just let it warm up here a little bit. And then I kicked the heater on, and you can see how dramatic it was. Temperature went there on the coolant from 136. It just plummeted down to 66, which was actually cooler than the ambient temp. The ambient temp was about 70, so I think the coolant had been sitting there overnight, because this was the next morning from when I got everything installed, and it had, was still quite cold and that. So that was good, and then it just slowly started to ramp up the temperature there, and you can see this the amount of time from where I introduced it here. That's at the 579 seconds, and then over here this was 1100 seconds, so basically almost 600 seconds, 10 minutes I was running it here, and you can see what sort of gap it was. Now I was just idling the engine. I think I was running there about 1500 RPM or something, where I was just sort of letting it warm up, and I was just wanting to make sure that there wasn't any air in the system, and fortunately there wasn't. So then I repositioned the aircraft, and that's what these dashes are here, where basically I shut it down and repositioned it and then fired it up again. And so the goal now was to do sort of the same type of thing I did the last time, where I was just going to run it to say 30% power and see where it would stabilize, where the oil temperatures would stabilize and where the coolant temp would stabilize. So the same thing when I started up here, I didn't have the heater on, so this loop wasn't running. And then as I brought, just before I brought the power up there from idle, I kicked the heater loop on again. Of course, it was already warm from previously, so it wasn't starting completely cold. But as you can see there, it dropped down back to 125 on the coolant, and I let it run here. So this was 20 down the bottom there, about the 26-minute mark, all the way up here, ran it up there to about the 41-minute mark, so 15 minutes of running there. And you can see the delta, the gap there between the oil and the coolant. It's maintaining a really nice wide margin there, because the coolant was a problem before. But here you can see I ran it all the way up. I'm still climbing, so that power setting is just a little bit too much to get it to stabilize It's just slightly more than what I had last time, but just a little too much to get it to stabilize. But the gist of this whole thing is I got the oil temp there to 250. In fact, I think I went to 252, and the coolant temp was 226. So it basically brought the coolant into a place now where it's not the thing that I need to worry about. It's going to stay under that 240, because the 240 is where it starts to basically boil, and then it's no good to me. It'll just basically overflow. So I think I fixed that problem and bought myself a bunch of time. So after that, I just let it cool down for a little bit and got organised, and I was going to go and do a run down the runway, which you'll see here shortly. So the next thing I need to do when the engine's cold again, which will probably be tomorrow, is start out and just do a run all the way to full power and see how long I can maintain full power, and then where I need to drop back in terms of what's going to be the thing that kind of prevents me from keeping full power in like I've done before. So that'll give me the other data point that I need, and I'll be able to use that amount of time to determine exactly how much time I have for a climb out to at least pattern altitude or more. I absolutely believe that this is going to buy me probably a couple of minutes that I didn't have before, just because of how much that 5 gallons adds. Pretty much before the heater loop had about 0.9 of a gallon is what I calculated. So now I've got 6 times that. So it should buy me 6 times the amount of time from when I turn that on. And also too, the tanks are now radiating quite a bit of heat off of them, because there's over 6 feet of square footage of surface area there. And they're constantly going to be sort of feeding or radiating heat off of there, which is going to help cool that coolant back down again. So that's all good. And one other thing I did since last time, I actually dropped the boost on the second turbo by just adjusting the line that was running to the wastegate controller. And so I've got it, instead of the first turbo compressor side feeding back to that second wastegate, I've basically just opened that up to ambient. So now the wastegate is opening up about 4 pounds of boost earlier. So it's, instead of getting like 43 pounds of boost, I'm getting about 39. And I'm getting the same amount of power, but everything's just cooler. So the charge air now coming out of the the second turbo is much cooler. So let's have a look at that here and just go through the run that you're about to see. All right, so let's see. This is what it looked like here. I guess let's start out on this screen here. So I'm basically pulling onto the runway here, and just running low power. And then when I put the heater on, the cabin heater on there to run that coolant down, and you can see it even after just idling around a little bit, it dropped down to 150, which is way lower than it ever was after I'd been taxing down there. And then I think it climbed up here a little bit, because maybe there was sort of some warmer coolant in that system, because it's interesting that it climbs up as I go to full power, but then it starts to drop off almost even before I come off the power. But there's still a really good delta there. So even at the worst point here, or the closest point at 171 on the coolant and 205 on the oil temp. So, but as I say, I'm going to need to do some runs and that where I can hold it at full power for a little while. But as you can see here, the RPM on the engine's still getting up there, 3875, 3890. So I'm getting the same amount of power that I had before, and then we're just less boost. So if you look here at the boost is down here, the purple one, 39.8. Well, normally by about there it would have been 43 point something, 43.1. So I'm about 3 pounds less there. And subsequently this temperature up here, the turbocharger compressor outlet temperature coming out of the second turbo, that's actually cooler now. So 298 here, normally that would have gone off the scale, because those sensors only go to 305. And just extrapolating, it looks like it usually goes to about 315 or something. So I'm about 15, 17 degrees cooler there, and so that's helping everything. Keeping a bunch of stuff down. Obviously, the temperatures that flow after that, after it's gone through the intercooler there, and the secondary intercooler, so I'm still keeping good temps there. In fact, that first intercooler seems to be doing a pretty good job there. It's dropping the temperature 120 degrees at this point there. And one of the things I found out after analysing the data from last time was that the intercooler really is playing havoc with the radiator. It's the heat coming out of that intercooler is just basically heating up the radiator. So instead of the radiator getting a lot of cooling, it's kind of getting a wash because it's getting cooling on either side of it, but it's also getting the hot air coming through the middle of it. So it's too late to try and move it for the prototype here, but this new tanks in the front there is really helping out because now I've got a separate way of cooling stuff off there that doesn't rely on going through the radiator. And now that I've dropped the boost here, that's also brought me another around about 20 degrees of temperature drop there. So everything is going in the right direction in terms of getting the cooling under control. And it just remains to be seen how it is for a full power run, and then ultimately the next flight to see how it all works. But still getting the same fuel flow there, 20 gallons an hour, which on this thing equates what it says here, the math force 467 horsepower. I don't believe that. I believe it's more like 330, but at least relative to what I had before, by changing the boost and dropping it, I haven't lost any power. In fact, I think I've gained a little bit here just because the temps are lower. And the temperatures factor into what that calculation is there. And even on the turbine inlet temperatures here, just on that little run there, we've only got to 1500 degrees, and I'm okay with it going to 1650. So yeah, it's all looking pretty good there. And I think now that the coolant temperature, and you see right after I sort of came off the power there, the coolant temperature here immediately comes back down there, 164. So I've got all kinds of headroom in there for running before that coolant's going to get too hot. And as I said, I didn't even start with this cold. It was already warm from running it on the ramp for 20 minutes or whatever. So yeah, it's all looking pretty good. But anyway, I'll let you have a look at that run, and then we'll see how that looks. But yeah, overall, I'm pretty happy with how things are working out with this new coolant tank setup in the nose. Alright, so this is just going to be a quick run just to see how things are performing to the 1,000-foot mark now that I've got that boost reduced a little bit, and with the new coolant tanks in the front. So yeah, I just wanted to see how it was performing. I had a decent crosswind again here that sort of pushed me a little bit on the right there as I took off, but got it under control a little bit, and I've got to wait until 20 knots comes in before I got any real rudder control. So it's sort of a dance between standing a little bit on the brake to keep it lined up and then transitioning to full rudder. So yeah, it seems to be accelerating about the same as you'll see here. It hits the 1,000-foot mark around about 61, 62 knots, same as before. So cooler temps, but the same amount of power basically. So the next thing for me to do, and I've actually already done, is do the weight and balance again with the tanks in the front, and then put that into my spreadsheet and see where the static margin is, and then go ahead and make any adjustments I need to try and get it balanced left and right again, and just make sure that the static margin is over, close to or over 10%. And then I'll be back out on the runway again and dial in the elevator trim position, so it's just getting the nose off around about 80 knots. And then I'll be ready for another, probably a ground effect test if I get a day where there's no wind. Other than that, I'll start planning for the next flight to see what that's going to look like, but I should be able to at least get up to pattern altitude, so I need to think about what that profile is going to look like, what runway to depart off of, and where to come back in if I have a problem again. Because if I'm going to climb higher, going back around and landing on 4, if I'm already at 1,000 feet, is probably not an option unless I do a really wide pattern and just basically plan for that. So yeah, back on that boost thing, it was something that was in the back of my mind for a long time, but I completely forgot about that. I hadn't really adjusted that. I don't have a boost control or anything like that, but I guess what was happening on the engine there is just running higher boost than I need to, so I'm just compressing the air more than I need to. It's just getting hot, and there's plenty of air going to the engine. I just didn't need to compress it quite so much, so dropping that sort of 3 or 4 psi has made things much better. Anyway, that's this update. Tune in again for the next one and see what I got for you. Cheers.